Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I've come from the International Molybdenum Association, which is based in the UK. We've actually just been having a meeting in Vale, very close by, last week, and I was invited to come and make this presentation by Climax Molybdenum. So I'm going to be talking to you about molybdenum science from the perspective of the data generation that we have done, the technical scientific data, and also giving examples of the increasing uptake and adoption within the regulatory community of that science, which of course is something that you are considering here in Colorado. So we'll start with just a few real basics. Molybdenum, it is an inorganic, naturally occurring substance in the Earth's crust in the form of the molybdenite ore. And really, what's very interesting is the fact that it is an essential element. So for humans, animals and plants, there is no survival without it. So it's kind of awesome in that respect. And so because of that, we do have on our IMOA website a whole section about essentiality. And what I'm doing in this presentation is also giving you the URL so that afterwards, if you're interested to follow up, you can do that and look at things in more depth. So we have, as I said, a section. It gives you high-level messages, and then it also gives you evidence-based references. So again, you can drill down as far as you wish. So molybdenum is bioessential to humans, animals and plants. It's trace elements that is really very important for generation of cellular energy and also elimination of waste from the body. And it's very important in certain enzymes that make all that happen. Okay, so again, essentiality, we have a PDF about it. It's in English and it's in Spanish. You can download it and it gives many more details. So if we move on now, still at the basics level, well, Moly makes products for a more sustainable world. And that includes very much stainless steel. It's recyclable, long-lasting, corrosion resistant and very strong. And Moly also has a much higher melting point than many of the other metals, in fact of most other metals, and that makes it a critical component in steels for transportation, for construction and also for renewable energy industries. If we just look here at the slide, it's quite interesting to see these are samples of steel with and without molybdenum. You don't need a lot of molybdenum to make a big difference. Normally it's about 2%. The basic stainless steel moly containing grade is 316. If you have a 304 grade, that's no moly. So the one on the left is 304, no moly, and then 15 years later, the one with 2% moly is shiny and new, just as if it was installed yesterday. So, and that's why it's used a lot for street furniture. It's very much used in seaside locations, high chloride, anything with a more aggressive environment. And it stops the pitting and the staining. And the one on the right is the Milisita Bridge in Finland. They're very big on stainless steel in Finland. It's one of the largest European corporations making stainless steel has its base there. And they do all sorts of wonderful things with stainless steels. So also in Toronto here, we have a bridge that is being installed now that is nearing completion. Moly has applications in, as I said, in street furniture and also in very significant constructions and bridges. And if you're thinking, well, which bit of the bridge is stainless steel, there's a lot of it. It's not just the outside that you see. It's in the structural elements, it's in the columns, it's in the beams, the plates, the arches, and different types of beams, all of which are given extra strength by the addition of molybdenum. So a little goes a long way in terms of the properties that it gives to the steel. And if we're looking here in Washington, then they have a significant commitment to type 316, this basic grade, and they're doing, I think it's a Great Streets program, and they're going to be spending $100 million over the next 20 years to replace all the bus shelters. I mean, lots of snow in Washington, and so it's termed an aggressive environment. On our website, actually, we have a system that you can go and look at the kind of climatic conditions you have, and the application that you're thinking of, and it will tell you which is the right grade of stainless steel, because there are actually lots of grades. So molybdenum, where are you getting it? How are you uptaking it? Because as I said, it's an essential element. Well, you get it in leafy green veggies, in your kale and spinach, and in legumes and grains and pulses, and also, it's a standard component in your vitamin and mineral supplement. If you look on the tube, it's all written in very small letters, but generally the long word that you can't read, that's molybdenum. So it's also used in green and clean energy production, in the sense that solar panels in the photovoltaic cell, there's a layer of molybdenum under the glass screen. And also in wind turbines, it's not always the actual steel structure, it's the cogs and wheels inside. If you think, there's a lot of stress on those cogs and wheels as they're going around. In the petrochemical industry, it's used for hydrocracking, and the catalytic process that actually removes sulfur from, we would say petrol, you say gas. So again, very environmentally friendly application. And it's also used very extensively in lubricants and greases, because of the laterite structure, it's good for that application. And an essential component of equipment necessary for US national defense, for tanks and weaponry, that kind of thing. And primary original use, it was in Allied efforts during the Second World War. So that's just a little bit on applications. And this is a wider helicopter view of the different sectors of use. As I said, a little goes a long way, and it goes into lots of different sectors. In the automotive sector, it's important in lightweighting vehicles. It's all about nowadays, the environment, and making sure that there is as little pollution, contamination as possible. And so lightweighting vehicles is a very important sector. Oil and gas for the big oil pipes, not just the pipes themselves, but the welding of them. And process industry, food industry, we're all very much into our food nowadays. A lot of it is done in these stainless steel processing units, and there's moly there. So it's pretty ubiquitous in nature and also in these systems. And so if we're looking at the production of moly, it's about 280,000 tons globally. And just to put that in context, if another big product is copper, well, that's 18 million tons globally. So we're very niche. We're actually called a noble alloy. So that's a nice name for us, moly, the noble alloy. And it's sourced from primary and co-product mines, and of course you have your primary climax mine here in this state. So just a little bit about Imoa, where have I popped up from all of a sudden? I work for this organisation that was established in the late 1980s. We're based in the UK. We're one office looking at global issues. We don't have regional offices around. There are only just 5 of us. And for that reason, we importantly work with expert external technical support on environmental human health issues, sustainability, market development, all that kind of thing. So we're a network, but the core is just 5 of us. And we have members from 18 different countries. It's very much a global membership. Europe, America, Russia, China, everywhere. And it's made up of molybdenum primary and co-processors and producers and downstream users. And we have just a small number of committees. I'm from the Health, Safety and Environment Committee. And Imoa is also tied in and plugged into the North American Metals Council and several other metal trade associations in Europe. So our primary objective in our committee is to develop high-quality environmental and human health science that addresses regulatory issues, precisely your interest, fills critical data gaps in the molybdenum effects data set. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what that is. 15 member companies have seats on our committee, and a lot of the big moly producers and users, and they provide technical expertise. And our recent significant accomplishments that I'm going to talk a little bit more about is developing this molybdate effects data set, because when molybdate is in the environment, it's not molybdenum, it's molybdate when it's in an aqueous environment. And we've done several important human health studies, and we have also taken our data to the OECD to have a quality endorsement on the standard of the data that we produced. And most recently, you'll have heard about our 2-generation reproduction toxicity study. And really, yes, we're a data source for our members, we're a data source for regulators, all interested parties. You know, the transparency for us is a very important issue. So, and you know, we're building data which is being used very widely, because the trend nowadays very much is, you know, societal and regulatory control over the whole supply chain. So if we have kind of a elementary supply chain there, and then we can bring in on the mining side, society is interested in all of that, you know, and it's good. It's very good to have this engagement. And we need to be able to have the data to respond to inquiries and their interest. And the global regulatory focus, you know, is very much looking now at global chemicals management. You know, the OECD have the United Nations Environment Programme. They have a strategic approach to international chemicals management. It's called SICAM. And by 2020, all countries are supposed to have chemicals management legislation in place. It's happening. It's not happening perhaps fast enough, but because first of all you make an inventory and then you do the management. So some countries are only at the stage of putting together their inventory. But when you've got your chemical system in place, then you're very much looking at, you know, making sure that the hazards can be reduced, ensuring proper supply chain management, better tracking chemicals in articles, and guaranteeing the safe treatment of waste and end of life. So all this really prompted, and this is just to explain the background of why we were generating, we had a whole very significant program to generate data in the EU, and that's because they introduced a chemical regulation called REACH, and it's an acronym. It means registration of chemicals, evaluation of them, authorization of them, and restriction of chemicals. And it was brought in for the large-scale improvement of human health and the environment in Europe. That's not to say that we didn't have environmental legislation before. This umbrella regulation replaced about 40 individual regulations. And it's about hazard identification, hazard risk assessment, and very much communication along the supply chain about the safe handling and use of chemicals. And it's a substance-specific legislation, so it's very much looking in depth at individual substances. So when we were tasked with that, the first thing that we did was think, well, okay, who may have done something similar and you know, get us on track. And so we looked at the US EPA IRIS database. And they have had an entry since '92 that was based on 1992 data. It hasn't been updated since then. And so, I mean, now we're 27 years later. And so there was a big task for us to do to put a lot of data into place. You know, it's a bit like going to the doctor. If you have an ailment and you want him to evaluate you, you want him to evaluate you on his knowledge now, not his knowledge 27 years ago. So that then prompted us to really start to set out the program of investment and scientific research that needed to be done. And this is just an example of, you know, well, what did the European chemical agencies do? They sent you a 9-page document of all the endpoints, you know, and then we call an endpoint something like toxicity to reproduction or developmental toxicity, various endpoints in the aquatic environment. And for metals and mining, you're very much in the top tonnage band over 1,000, and all the R's mean that the data is required. So it was a case where we didn't have it. We jolly well had to make sure that we put good studies into place. So that was really the driver for a lot of the work that the regulatory community in Colorado are now looking at. And when we'd done that massive exercise, we took 3 years to get everything into place and submit our data sets. And then what we did was we took our data set, so our molybdate data set, all about molybdenum, to the OECD. And why did we do that? It's because we wanted them to examine the data and to see if they were satisfied with the quality of it. Because if you have scientists from all the OECD member countries that are able to look at it, and if they look and they approve, well, of course, it's an endorsement of the quality and the reliability of that data. So we then embarked on that process, and we had meetings in Washington, and we were awarded the mutual acceptance of data set. I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So our data set is a key tool for determining safe concentrations of moly in the environment. And it contains physicochemical data, environmental human health data, and it's all generated from very rigorously conducted studies about the molybdate ion. That's the moiety of concern. That's the thing that could cause a toxic effect in humans, plants, and animals. And so the other question that I think will be on your mind is, to what extent can the Moa molybdate effects data set be relied upon? And I think the best way of that is to give you some examples of how our data set is being uptaken and used by regulators in their rule making. So we'll be coming on to that. So we took an iterative approach. We first of all generated this data set in accordance with that matrix. We took it to the OECD. We achieved mutual acceptance of data, and then it was we are now in the process of disseminating that data, making it available to everybody, and just saying, look, here's the data, you assess it for global regulatory use. Because as I said, the United Nations have this program that everybody has to have chemicals management. So a slide about the OECD, make sure that we're on the same page. It's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it's really a grouping of industrialized countries. You can see on the right-hand side we have the Americas, Canada, Mexico, the United States, and a lot of European countries. And they are the body that put together the protocols and the guidelines against which these technical studies have to be done. And a mutually accepted data set is really the starting point for introducing or reviewing legislation about substances in an OECD member country. So that's all those in Europe, yourselves in the United States, in Canada, this is the starting point. And so what does our data set look like? If you're interested, okay, so where can I go and get this data set that's being talked about? Well, the OECD, they have a website. The URL is along the bottom. It's their existing chemicals database, and you can see up there that it's highly soluble molybdenum salts data set. And you might think, well, okay, but it's moly disulfide that they're mining up there, which is not so much of a soluble substance, which is good. But we use for our testing the most soluble substance, because that gives you the worst case result. It's most available to be uptaken by the organism. And so if you get the worst case result, that is also the most precautionary approach. Yeah? And in our case, when we presented our data, the OECD countries that fielded scientists to review it all included the USA, and also Australia, Canada, Netherlands, the UK, and the OECD Secretariat. So you can be reassured that it was crawled over. We got about 40 pages of questions and 1 month to answer everything. So it was quite an intensive, interesting process to be going through. So I'm going to talk now about a few examples of the regulatory uptake. So you've understood about the data set, the molybdate effects data set, and where has it gone since then? How is it being used by rule makers? This is just a quick overview slide. In the USA, for example, moly water quality standards, the American Toxic Substances Disease Registry are doing a moly profile. EPA Moly Health Advisory is being reviewed, and they are looking at our data, and also in children's safe products. In Canada, Chemicals Management Plan, they're looking at inorganic substances between 2018 and 2020. They are reviewing many inorganics, including molybdenum. And again, water quality standards at federal and county level. And also in Europe, the Water Framework Directive, they draw up a list of potential contaminants that need regulating. They had molybdenum on the list. They did take our data, and then we were not any longer in the queue for being regulated. Moly water quality standards, soil screening values, and also Germany hazard classes, water hazard classes. And then it should really be Australasia, shouldn't it? In Australia, they have, it's called the NICNAS program. Again, it's chemical assessment. And in Korea now, they are just starting with their program. And in China and Thailand, there are upcoming similar programs. So everybody is being prodded by United Nations to get their house into order, which can only be a good thing. So if we look more closely at one or two of them, and we start with the Children's Safe Product Rule, other names are Toxic Free Kids legislation. It's something that is proliferating, and it's very important, of course. Nobody wants children or anybody really around toxic substances. And so molybdenum was actually on the list in Washington State. And this was the first state really that started with this type of legislation. And molybdenum compounds were on the list of chemicals of high concern. And so we went and we sat down with the regulator, just explained who we were, that we had this database and we would like to make it available to them. And then we drew back, no further involvement apart from following their webinars. And so a key component in their assessment was this molybdates effect data set. We engaged in regulatory dialogue with them, particularly because, understanding the moly toxicology and the robust recent science is very important to share the reality of the toxicology and also the perception. People can think moly, well, that's kind of strange name, must be a bit weird. But in actual fact, that isn't the case. And so when there are assessments, it needs to be based on today's science, on today's robust science. And also, if people have the wrong perception about moly toxicology or moly, then you can have some unwarranted substance stigmatization. And in these kind of legislations, they say, well, okay, every January, then any toys with any molybdenum content, and generally, it was in the buckle of a toy or a metal policeman's helmet or this kind of thing. And it's not there because it's intentionally put there, it's because the steel has some moly in it, because a lot of steel is recycled, and then you get, they're making their steel melt up, and then there is moly in it. So we were in there, and actually it was the 7th most reported substance in Washington. And so you have to report it, and then they can ask for it to be phased out. So for all those reasons, it's very important that the toxicology is understood. And the outcome of that was that moly compounds were delisted and deregulated, and that was in 2017. It also dissociates, doing this kind of dialogue is important because it dissociates moly from the kind of so-called heavy metals. It's in inverted commas because there really isn't a definition of that, except people think heavy metals toxic. And molybdenum is heavy in the sense of density. It's a very dense metal and it has a very high melting point. But, it's not heavy metal in the sense of toxicity. If you're thinking about, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, that kind of thing, we are in a completely different league. So this actually is just a screenshot of the permanent rulemaking order, so that you can see that after that dialogue, moly, there were about 20 chemicals that were added and there were 3 chemicals that were removed. And moly and compounds at the bottom there were removed. And so that was deregulation at the end of September 2017, using as an assessment tool our molybdate effects data set. And we just went back and checked afterwards. We said, okay, let's have a look at their 2019 listing. Is Moly still on the list for any reason? And no, if you look at the M section, there's no M for molybdenum. Then in Oregon, they had done a similar thing, and they had started with the basis of anything that is on Washington legislative list has to be on our list. So at the beginning, and then you have to wait until they have like a triennial review, and then you can have a dialogue about your substance. So we had a dialogue with them in last year, 2018. It was a quicker process than in Washington State. And here again, after they had reviewed the molybdate data set that we provided, at the end of the process, the outcome was deregulation of molybdenum and compounds. And that's just a shot of the permanent administrative order, so you can see the paperwork. Okay, if we move now from a state level to a kind of cross-border initiative, there is, or there has been, the US-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council initiative, and to our surprise, we popped up as a case study. The initiative itself is looking at how Canada and America can jointly work together to do these risk assessments. And so they're focusing on identifying what difference they have and what impediments they have to work together. And they were doing this through the lens of doing some case studies. For Moly, they were looking at biomonitoring. Biomonitoring because, as I mentioned earlier, we are bioessential. We are a biomonitoring. You will pick us up in biomonitoring. And if you didn't, you should be worried. You know, we have to be there, so you will find Moly. But that's not a cause for concern. So Moly was also selected because I understood that we were a forward priority for both EPA and TSCA evaluation. When we are on this list of 73 substances for evaluation under TSCA, we're not a priority yet, it seems, for that process to be actually happening. And for Canada, they have their Chemicals Management Programme, their CMP, and so they have Health Canada and Environment Canada that were both engaged in this process. And so that's just a shot there. You can see that those were the 5 substances, and Moly compounds was one of them. We kind of were a bit surprised that why molybdenum? Why would we pop up? And then this is done also with the American Chemistry Council, and one of our members is Chevron. And they had said to the committee, oh, Moly has such a great data set. You know, you can make a really thorough assessment if you use their data. Would have been nice if they'd have told us before they volunteered us, but we were able to take up the baton. So that's a kind of cross-border initiative that Moly has also been looked at. You know, they have a primary Moly mine in Canada as well, the Endako mine. So out of this whole process, then Health Canada co-authored a publication which is about biomonitoring equivalents. It's really quite highly technical, but I have just put a little extract there because it refers to a 90-day toxicity study published by Murray et al. That is the 90-day toxicity study that was commissioned by IMOA. And interestingly, it says at the bottom that they're using, you know, these studies because these studies have higher reliability than other ones because they were conducted according to these OECD test guidelines and good laboratory practices. So again, you know, at a national level, they're recognizing that these are quality endorsements of the reliability of the data and the caliber of the data. So I've just talked about 3 human health studies. These are the ones. And they are OECD protocol compliant. You know, when you're doing a study, you can't choose how you do it. This is not like a kind of PhD effort. It is highly prescriptive, and these methodologies are set out by the OECD. And GLP means good laboratory practice. And that's also an accreditation system. And so, and it's like a kind of audit trail, because when you get a report from one of these labs, you know, the kind of text part of it may be about 30 pages and then 170 pages of data because everything has to be traceable, tracebackable. I've just highlighted Alan Hoberman here in red. He was the study director for the 2-generation reprotox study that we did recently, and it's worth mentioning him because he was actually he still is, or was the past president, the most recent past president of the US Teratology Society. And that's kind of the equivalent of, say, the College of Surgeons. If you're a surgeon, you're a member of the professional body. He was the president of let's call it the Reprotox Society. So that is also an indication of the caliber of individuals that were overseeing the study. So a bit of a kind of screen grab here from the OECD website. This is what they are saying about the OECD guidelines and the protocols, that they are the tool for assessing the potential effects of chemicals on human health and the environment, accepted internationally as standard methods for safety testing. The guidelines are used by professionals in industry, academia and government involved in the testing and assessment of chemicals, and they are regularly updated with the assistance of hundreds of national experts of the OECD member countries. So that is a very broad swathe of professionals that are focused on making sure that these methodologies and protocols are very rigorous. So again, why did we do higher tier human health studies? Well, we had our REACH data matrix that said they had to be done. And when we were looking around, because first thing you do is a literature search and see what is there out there already, and is it reliable? And there were critical data gaps that needed filling, these higher tier ones, the 90-day, the repeated dose toxicity, the prenatal developmental toxicity, and the reproductive toxicity. And there was an absence, a complete absence of OECD guideline compliant studies and ones with GLP certification. So we were looking for the gold standard. You know, what's the gold standard? And then let's work on that. There were existing literature assessments about molybdenum, and they were looking at the reproductive toxicity endpoint as the most sensitive human health endpoint, because that was based on this Fungi 1990 study. You may well have heard about that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And also water quality standards were being decided based on the Fungi study. Water quality standards protective of human health, because you know in the quality standard you can be protective of the aquatic environment and human health, various levels. Those are the references at the bottom for those pieces of literature. So we realized that there was nothing in place that was modern and robust, and so we undertook in IMOA to commission a study to the Charles River Laboratory here in the US, in Pennsylvania, and it really was the culmination of 5 years' work. You know, these aren't quick things to do. And so from 2014 to 2018, we were working on that, starting with the palatability study, the rangefinder, the main study, and then it was a further year to do the publication, which I know that in Colorado State people have been waiting for. And so it is now published. When you send a publication or a manuscript, they call it, to a journal, the journal then gets peer reviewers, so experts in that field to review it. We don't know who they are. And it's a long study. I thought, you know, they may come up with 1 or 2 peer reviewers, but they came up with 3 peer reviews. And ultimately it was published online at the beginning of January. It's open access. That means that it's free to download. Often in the regulatory community, you know, there are a lot of restrictions, and downloading, you know, when you download a whole set of studies, that actually racks up the bill. So we want to make sure our data is disseminated as widely as possible, and so it's free to download. So that's the link over there if you're going to rush to your computers after this presentation and download it if you don't have it already. So a word about the Fungi study that's also available online, and I just did a slide. It indicates there that part of the work, part of the reason that Thomas Fungway did this work was for his PhD, for his Doctor of Philosophy. And, you know, it's very fair to say that in the absence of an OECD regulatory compliant GLP study, then the Fungway study was understandably the one that was going to be picked up and used, because, you know, pretty much it was the only show in town. So that's what was used. That is no longer the case, as we now have the 2-generation reprotox study that has been conducted and now peer-reviewed, published at the beginning of this year. So there now is a weight of evidence against which to relook at through the lens of the Fungway study. Okay, so our study was unable to reproduce the findings reported in Fungway. And actually, we didn't just have one go at doing this. You know, the 3 human health studies that I indicated earlier, they all had reprotox elements. When we were doing repeated dose toxicity, we did some additional parameters to look to see, can we, because when you're doing the science, you're looking to see if what was found can be reproduced. Was what they found a reliable finding. And so we tried 3 times, and, you know, it's 3 studies we did. You know, it was a couple of $1 million that we spent, you know, very rigorously looking to see can his findings be reproduced. We weren't able to reproduce them. The Colorado current Moly water quality standard is based on Fungway at 210 micrograms. You know, why can one say that this is a less reliable study? Because, for example, you know, it's not possible when you look at how it's been reported to determine the exact dose levels of the test material that was consumed by the rats in the Fungway study, and neither the water intakes or the body weights were reported, and all these things are very critical to be able to really interpret the data that you have. So. If you will be interested, I'm sure, in comparing and contrasting, and we have a section in the document, in the publication, a whole section that is comparing and contrasting and explaining what we were looking for and why it wasn't found and possible interpretations. So we're focused here on comparing and contrasting Fungway with the 2-gen study, but also, you know, it's very important to, I think, state the bottom line that in these studies, reproductive toxicity was not identified. So this slide is just giving you an indication of the highest dose levels that were used in these studies were, you know, milligrams of moly per kilo body weight per day, and that is what is determined in those studies as the no observed adverse effect level, because even at that level there was no toxicity. And in terms of systemic toxicity, because we're looking at the reproductive endpoint and then we're looking holistically, and the only thing that happened was a little bit of lower body weight gain. So in the 2-gen results, you know, if we're being a bit more technical, there were no test substance related effects on the estrous cycle, semen evaluation, mating, duration of gestation, litter size, pup weights, postnatal development, all the endpoints. And as I said, you know, this is a guideline study, it's prescribed. The lab has to look for all these endpoints, and then it has to report. And so there were no adverse effects on reproductive function or development. I mean, that actually is very good news for Molly. Let's move now to a different regulatory authority, the Food and Drug Administration. Here in 2018, they have produced new guidelines regarding elemental impurities, molybdenum, being one of them, in branded generic drug products. That went into effect, and I've just put a screenshot of that in the presentation, because they also used one of the 3 studies that I was mentioning, the 90-day repeated dose toxicity study. Even take you right straight to the page, the Molly section on pages 46 to 47. And there it's talking about a good laboratory practice compliance 90-day toxicology study, which is the 90-day study. And then there's the author there, the Murray et al. That's the write-up that was done. So again, just an illustration that a US government agency is doing its literature search, it's looking for what it considers to be a reliable study, and this is the one that they were using. So that's uptaking the molybdate effects data set and using it for their regulatory purposes. Excuse me, just a moment. We're doing a tour of US agencies this morning, aren't we? And lots of acronyms. The Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, ATSDR. They, for the first time, are doing a toxicological profile on molybdenum. And it's not a leaflet, it's 270 pages. So, you know, that's a big assessment. And I understand that that's something also that the Colorado regulatory community are interested in looking at. And so just to share with you that when they do this kind of work, first of all, they do a public consultation and like a data call-in, you know, if you like to send data. And so obviously we sent our data set, and they started in 2017. It's taken them a while, not because Molly is so complicated, but because then other substances came in, these PFOS, PFOA substances that kind of took a lot of headspace of the agency. So now they've gone back to continuing with their review, and they are taking account of our studies, and in fact they asked to wait till our 2-gen reprotox study had been published so that they could take that into account into their assessment. Hopefully it will be finalized soon. So, but that's coming, that's in the pipeline. And I think it's quite near the end. We have to wait and see. So again, quick screenshot, those are the 3 key studies that we have been talking about. And every time you do a study, we're trying to advance the science. We're trying to make sure that it's robust, it's reliable. And in doing that, we are then decreasing the level of uncertainty about whatever one is investigating. So in our case, you know, if you start with the Kowalski study in 1961, which is actually the basis of the EPA IRIS database, and then fungi came along, and then the 3 in blue are the studies that IMOA commissioned. You know, you have a higher level of uncertainty. We are learning a lot more now, and it's all being done according to very prescriptive protocols that are set internationally. Then that surely is reducing some of the uncertainty around all these topics. So you saw that Kowalski was on the left. Now Kowalski is a study that was done in Armenia about the uptake of molybdenum in humans via consumption of local vegetables grown round near a mine location. And yes, in 1961, it was the only show in town. Now we're a good many years later, and ATSDR, example that for themselves, are concluding that that is a low confidence study when you look at it in the context of the knowledge that we have today, and not a suitable basis for deriving a chronic oral minimal risk level, which is one of the things that they derive in their tox profile, and it's a key derivation that they make. Also the panel on micronutrients from the Institute of Medicine, they had similar concerns about poor reliability of the study. They talk about serious methodological difficulties, analytical problems, very small size of the control group. You know, nowadays the control group is all mandated, it has to be a specific size. Because if you only have a very small control group, you don't have the statistical relevance and reliability. But despite all that, Kowalski is still the key study in the IRIS database for Molly, because it was done in 1990, IRIS was done in 1992, and they haven't come back to it. Molly hasn't been a sufficiently high priority. And also it's still the basis for the still current Molly Health Advisory. The latest edition is 2018, but that didn't change. I think that was kind of picking up on little typos and small things of that. It wasn't actually doing much of an assessment. The Molly Health Advisory is being worked on, I understand. It is being reviewed, and they are also at the Office of Water taking into account our data. So I've almost finished the tour here. Let's go across the border again to Canada, Saskatchewan province. They're not counties, are they? As I said earlier, they're provinces. And they had there an existing Moly water quality standard of 73 micrograms of Moly per litre as a standard to be protective of aquatic life. And then there was a third party, it wasn't ourselves that went to Saskatchewan, but a company that works in Saskatchewan that said, could we share our data set with your data set with our regulatory authorities? And they did that, and they did a 2-year review, and they did a public consultation and everything. And at the end of it, the authorities, they increased their Moly water quality standard from 73 micrograms to 31,000 micrograms. So that was a huge increase. In fact, you know, over a 420-fold increase, given their confidence in the reliability of the data. And it's a bit slightly blurred, this screen, but all of the data points there except for one, the Lucas, the trout study, are drawn from the IMOA molybdate data set, which is the one that we provide to everyone. So you could think, well, Saskatchewan, they might just be a province that's a bit kind of way out there. So if we look in a moment at the federal level, we'll tell you what's happening there. But that's just a slide that gives you an indication that in that process, they also recognize OECD and mutual acceptance of data. And that is one thing that they found as a big reason to be confident in the data that they were making their assessment on. And so, yes, at a federal level in Canada, as I said, they're doing their chemicals management plan. They're looking at ecological risk classification of inorganic substances, and the value that they have there is 26,000. So we're talking in the same ballpark. We're not talking 73. So that's the value for protective aquatic life in Canada, the federal level. So just a quick roundup here, just to put it all on just one slide. We started in 2007 because of the European Chemicals Agency saying, we need all this data, huge data matrix. So we did that. We call it the molybdate effects data set. We used it in 2010 for the registrations for the EU REACH regulation. Then we took it to the OECD for the mutual acceptance of data quality endorsement, which we received. And then since then, we have been providing it to all interested parties. And we provide them the data, we stand back, and they make their assessment. So that's been done in Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, ATSDR, Moly Health Advisory, Canada at a federal level, at a provincial level. New Jersey also, they had a water quality standard. They were looking at which substances to prioritize for regulation. They then they hadn't prioritized Moly, but they didn't prioritize it. In Pennsylvania in 2013, they were looking at regulating Moly in surface water. We provided input in our data set, and they decided not to regulate. Flanders and Germany, it's not just ourselves as IMOA that engage, as you know, obviously with Climax Molybdenum. The companies themselves, they provide this data. And on the horizon, we have more globally, Korea, China, Thailand, and more data for EU REACH, no doubt. So really, you know, looking forward, the way forward is I think we all have common goals, because we're all looking to utilize the high quality human health and environmental science for the regulation of molybdenum. And, you know, it's important we're maintaining and developing regulatory dialogue through the knowledge sharing and these scientific study resources. So really, that's the roundup to my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.